Hi, everyone. Um, just sort of getting back to where we were in chapter 1. We left off talking about theories. More specifically, we had discussed the different types of sociology, pure, applied, basic in that sense. And then we had begun to discuss and move into the theoretical perspectives in sociology. So, if you recall, we had discussed the concept of a theory, which I'm sure you guys have heard of quite often. Theory is that general statement about how some parts of the world fit together and how they work. So it's definitely a different explanation of how two or more facts are related to one another. So what happens is sociologists use these three different theoretical perspectives to really understand and guide how we understand social behavior. So we're going to break each one of these down a little bit more in detail, okay? But I want you guys to become familiar with them because they're going to carry us throughout our course this year, okay? Not necessarily hard, but you do need to understand what these three core ones are. So the three main ones are symbolic interactionism, functionalist analysis, and conflict theory, okay? All right. Let's move into the first one, symbolic interactionism. This is where we view symbols, okay? These are things to which we attach some type of meaning to, right? The concept is, in this theory, that those symbols are at the basis of our social life. So, through the use of symbols, people are able to define certain kinds of relationships to others. They're able to coordinate behaviors and actions with other people. You know, it makes social life possible in a sense, and it helps develop a sense of them ourselves overall. Symbolic interactionists focus on much smaller scale things, micro, which we'll talk about later on down the road here. But understand, we're looking at those very intimate kind of relationships. So not necessarily the larger picture, like a society end of it, but we're looking at those individual relationships that surround us on a day-to-day basis. Your friendships, your relationships with significant others, parents, whatever. They all can help us explain why things change and why people behave in the way that they do. These two guys, Mead and Cooley, okay, they developed the concept of symbolic interactionist here with the idea of symbols, right? Think about it. We live in a world where symbols surround us in everyday sort of kind of life, right? It's in every nook and cranny of everything that we do, right? So what ends up happening is that we attach meaning to certain kinds of symbols, okay? They guide us a lot of times in what we believe and how we act. They exist all around us. So what would these kind of labels be or symbols be? Think about that. When you're in a relationship, do you give them something? Back in the days, in the 50s and 60s, they used to give them like a Letterman jacket, right? And then you sort of, we're going steady, right? That was a symbol of that relationship and that status of that relationship. We attached a meaning that if you give somebody a jacket, a Letterman jacket, you're going steady, right? Do we do anything like that today? Think about it. When we get married, what are some of those symbols that we attach to things? We're going to break this down a little bit more in detail. Bloomer believed that symbolic interactionism, it's more than just symbols, right? Yeah, we might give a jacket to somebody, right? Or a promise ring to somebody. But those form some type of meaning for individuals, right? He believed, in a sense, that there are three main principles that sort of guide this. The first one is language. Think about it. If you attach the word boyfriend or girlfriend to somebody or partner to somebody, what does that mean to you? Does that mean you just don't talk to them ever again? Does that mean that you go on dates? Does that mean that you have to act or behave in certain ways? Right? When we use certain kinds of language, right, it attaches certain kinds of behaviors and interactions in that sense. The second is meaning, right? We attach a purpose to it. So all of a sudden, yes, I'm going to use the term boyfriend or girlfriend or partner, right? And that's going to mean something to me, right? I'm going to expect certain things to happen because I have that status. Think about it. Social media has changed the way you and I interact all the time. If people don't change their Facebook status, do they act different? Does that help explain certain things in that sense? What are those thought processes there that happen as a result of that? Right? All of that's important as we look through this. So we use the example of marriage, right? So when you guys decide to get married, think about some of these symbols, okay? We're going to talk about this more in class on Friday because I always like to do this more face-to-face. But I want you guys to really think about how this can be impacted by just the symbols that exist around us, okay? So we'll come back to this example in a sense, okay? But again, the central idea here is that those symbols guide us in everything that you and I do. It surrounds us as a whole, and it guides our behaviors in that sense. It sounds a little bit interesting, right? But symbolic interactionists really use the use of those symbols to define relationships and to have certain interactions with one another, right? Think about somebody that's studying divorce. They wouldn't necessarily focus on the changing meanings of marriage and family, right? And how that sort of contributed to that increase in the rate of divorce in the U.S. society. We'll jump into all this, but just to get you thinking, it's the idea of what things mean and how we behave in that stuff, okay? Let's move on now to functional analysis. This is that society is a whole unit, sort of with the idea that we're made up of interrelated parts that work together. So think about society, in a sense, as a structure, right? And all these different parts of society sort of fit together to make up a whole, sort of like a puzzle, right? And they all serve some type of function. Everybody, in some sense, in our structure of our society, contributes to society, in a sense. This theoretical framework basically views it as that, right? That in order for us all to function, we all have to work together in that sense to create some sense of equilibrium. Robert Merton used the term function to refer to the beneficial consequences that people might have to keep society stable. Okay? On the flip side of this, there's this concept of dysfunction, okay, which we'll get to here. So understand here that we're looking at society as that structure, how we fit everything together as a whole. A function is what each part does and how it sort of contributes to society. So we can either have, and a dysfunction can refer to consequences more so that undermine that stability overall. So functions can either be manifest, things that are intended, or latent, which are unintended. Okay, so let's look at this. When you go to school, right, we have very specific manifest functions, things that we intend school to do to us, right? Teach us, expand our knowledge, grow, all that kind of stuff, right? But of course, there's unintended functions as well for certain things. Maybe, let's be realistic here. It might be when you go to school, you're going to meet new people. Maybe that's going to be part of your dating pool or your friendship individuals that you meet, both good and bad in your life, right? There are, of course, latent functions, things that we don't expect. And of course, there's something called a hidden curriculum, which we'll jump into here down the road, where we learn other kinds of things like patriotism, how to follow rules. You know, when you're standing in line to go to the water fountain, you know, you don't cut. We learn those basic kind of concepts in school, even though that's not necessarily the main reason why we go, right? But they're still there. They're unintended functions that exist. We're going to come back to the divorce rate example in class and stuff, okay? But I want you guys to sort of look at this from the sense that when we're trying to explain divorce, right, a functionalist would look at how different functions have changed over the course of time. Okay? We're going to dive into all of these. I just want you to get slightly familiar with these concepts. All right. The final theory is called conflict theory. Now, this is going to sound familiar because of the Karl Marx, if you recall, and we talked about that struggle. So according to the conflict theory, society is viewed as a composed group competing for scarce resources, right? So think about this. We know it's tied to Karl Marx because if you remember, we talked about the bourgeoisie and the proletariats. Who are they? The bourgeoisie, if you remember, are those small group of capitalists who own that means of production. And the proletariats, right, are those masses of workers who are exploited by the capitalists, right? So let's apply it to today's day and age, right? So contemporary conflict theorists believe that there's conflict in almost everything that we do in relation to power and authority. And just like Marx stressed that conflict between the capitalists and the workers, right? There are other groups that say there's a conflict existing. Take, for instance, feminists. They're stressing a similar conflict between men and women, right? A glass ceiling existing for women to get into certain kinds of positions or fields or academic or career options just because of the gender component. We'll come back to the example of divorce and marriage in class, but I want you guys to understand that the perspectives differ in their level of analysis, okay? So what do I mean by this? Before I jump here, functionalists and conflict theorists provide something called macro level analysis, right? Macro level here is where we examine those large scale patterns of society, right? So functionalists and conflict theorists, we're looking at the bigger picture of things. We're not looking at those small, intimate relationships. We're looking at something much larger scale, how things sort of work as a whole in our society, okay? On the other side, symbolic interactionists, right, they carry out micro-level analysis because they're focusing on those small-scale patterns of social life, okay? What people are doing when they're in another one's presence, those small-scale relationships. So each of these perspectives provides a different and very contrasting kind of look at the world. But sociologists as a whole use all three of those theories, okay? Because they're all part of our reality. They're all things that we got to look at in order to better understand how things work. There is a chart in your book, if you have the book already, that breaks all this down. We can do this in class if you guys want to, but I'm not going to do it right now for purposes of things. All right. Now, one of the other things that I want to talk about is research, because you guys have already gotten some of your research paper information, and you're going to be starting on your first one. We know that common sense can't necessarily be relied on as a source of knowledge because there's often a very limited amount of information that we know sometimes as humans, right? So there needs to be more of an objective approach when we are trying to figure out understanding things and trying to figure out that truth, right? So to move beyond that common sense and to understand what's really going on, it's necessary for us to do something called sociological research. So Henslin, the author of our textbook, described 8 steps in this scientific research model, okay? And we're going to break all these down for you guys. Pretty basic, but I want you guys to become familiar with it. The first one is to select a topic, okay? This is guided by the concept that we're curious. We have interest in certain kind of topics, right? Sometimes if you're given certain research, maybe it's an academic reason. Maybe you're in a government position and you need to figure out certain things. Or it's a private source, whatever it is, right? Or maybe there's just a pressing social issue happening. Maybe you want to learn about homelessness and really dig into that. That's all about selecting your topic. The second is defining the problem. Here we're trying to figure out what that researcher wants to learn about. The third is where we begin to review that literature. So we begin to uncover things that we already know about the problem. It helps us narrow it down a little bit more and helps us figure out what gaps need to still be researched, and provides ideas about what questions to ask, right? So if I wanted to know about homelessness, there's tons of literature out there, especially about bigger cities, different areas that are doing things, right? But how much research has actually been done in Somerset County? When I did my dissertation for my doctorate degree, I focused in on those studies. Here, where are gaps within our state and in our county that we can better fit? So my research was focused more so on rural homelessness. We hear about urban all the time, but how much do we really know? Because it's such a hidden kind of topic. It doesn't look the same as somebody that's out on the street.